everybody. Can you hear me okay? Everyone back there? Great. Okay, so I provided a link to my slides up here just because I heard that it's quite difficult for people to read in the back, so in case you want to follow along on your laptop or mobile device, feel free. It's bit.ly/pycon-coding-compassion. Yes, so my name is Julie MacDonell. I'm originally from New York, but nowadays I'm living in Munich. So I'm living there and working as a Python developer. And today I'll talk to you about compassion in the software engineering world. This is my second time speaking at PYCON UK, and it's definitely not any less nerve-wracking the second time around. But I love coming to PyCons because I'm not sure what it is about Python, but it just seems to draw a lot of compassionate people. And yet, somehow, the software engineering field as a whole still doesn't seem to have the best reputation when it comes to compassion. I'd like to borrow a short story from a speech by David Foster Wallace. He recounts the story of two young fish swimming along one day, and they happen to meet an older fish swimming the other way, who nods at them and says, "Morning, boys, how's the water?" And the two young fish swim on for a bit, and then eventually one of them looks over at the other and goes, "What the hell is water?" A few months ago, I came to the realization that I was also like one of those young fish swimming along my day-to-day work. Our 4-person team had just finished up a very long and draining meeting, and as Raul, the other engineer on my team, and I were walking away from this meeting, I asked him, "Aren't you really glad we're on the team that we are on? I really appreciate that even when things get difficult, we can all stay level-headed and work really well together." And Raul turned to me, as a wise older fish did, and he asked, "Have you ever thought it's not just luck that we work well together, that it's actually that we choose to communicate to each other and behave with each other that makes us such a great team?" I tell this story because that moment changed the way that I thought about teams. That compassion tends not to be given enough credit for both the success and mental well-being of teams. And perhaps conversely, lack of compassion contributes to the difficulties that other teams experience. In his speech, Wallace explains, "The immediate point of the fish story is that the most obvious, ubiquitous, important realities are often the ones that are the hardest to see and talk about." So why is it that compassion is this important reality that we find so difficult to discuss, and especially so in the tech community? What exactly is compassion? We can easily place compassion on a scale of engagement when considering a subject who is suffering, where self-absorption represents the lowest level of engagement and compassion represents the highest. Self-absorption is simply not noticing that someone is suffering. This is not noticing that your team member has been struggling with that bug all week. Pity is acknowledging suffering. It's saying, "I see you have a problem. You have a bug in your code. Glad I'm not in your shoes." Sympathy says, "I see you have a problem, and I'm sorry that you're suffering. You have a bug in your code, and I'm sorry because I know that bugs can sometimes be frustrating." Empathy says, "I feel your suffering. You have a bug in your code, and that sucks for both of us." In fact, when scientists analyze the brains of people who are feeling deep empathy, they notice that such thinking lights up regions of the brain associated with pain. Compassion, at the highest level of engagement, says, "I see you have a problem, and I want to relieve your suffering. Let me pair with you so that we can fix this problem together." Compassion is a holistic understanding of a problem or the suffering of another person. Interestingly, whereas empathy lights up the regions of the brain associated with pain, research shows that when we think compassionately, we light up the regions of the brain associated with love. I can imagine that everyone in this room has had interactions with people in their lives who exhibited such behaviors at varying points of the spectrum, whether that be in personal life or in tech. You can probably even think of specific people or experiences that may have been represented by each of these behaviors. Yet when we think of successful teams and successful people, compassion isn't usually one of those first qualities that comes to mind. When was the last time you saw a job advertisement which listed kindness or compassion under requirements or would be nice to have? We think often of compassion as being soft, or perhaps even as a weakness. Compassionate people are viewed as pushovers in this dog-eat-dog world, where confidence, charisma, intelligence, and risk-taking are much more frequently mentioned when discussing successful teams. In 2012, Google began an initiative called Project Aristotle, which studied hundreds of their teams in an attempt to determine what makes them the most perfect, the most effective team, and conversely, what makes other teams less successful. The researchers scrutinized the compositions of the teams from every possible angle, from basic demographics and personality traits to things like similarities in hobbies and educational backgrounds. As it turned out, no matter which way the researchers analyzed the data, they could not determine any particular mix of specific personality traits or skills or backgrounds that made any difference in the effectiveness of a team. In fact, two teams could have nearly identical makeups, but they could have radically different levels of effectiveness. The researchers then switched their focus from team makeups to investigating behaviors that were considered part of team cultures. And what they discovered is that the critical quality in making a team effective is something called psychological safety. Psychological safety is defined by namely two behaviors: conversational turn-taking and average social sensitivity. Conversational turn-taking is a measure of how often people in a conversation switch from listening to talking back to listening. In fact, it's very easy to measure. Was every voice of the team heard, and were people speaking for equal lengths of time? Social sensitivity is a measure of how well someone can perceive and acknowledge another person's feelings. For example, how often does one colleague notice that another colleague is struggling? If they notice, do they try to understand and help their struggling colleague while staying non-judgmental? As psychological safety necessitates compassionate behavior, Project Aristotle shows us that we don't have to choose between being kind and being successful, and that thinking that these two are mutually exclusive is false. Research shows that it's ultimately easier, more fulfilling, and more sustainable to be a compassionate achiever. So I think at this point we can all probably agree that compassion brings some level of benefit to our teams. And yet you may be thinking, is it even possible to cultivate compassion as an adult? How set are we in our behaviors? Recent research suggests that by simply being mindful about compassion, our brains can develop to the point where they can make compassion our default behavior in just a number of weeks. These studies suggest that by practicing simple exercises, such as imagining a time when someone was suffering and wishing that the suffering was relieved, will more actively engage the areas of the brain associated with love and compassion. So perhaps you can, even in this moment, think of a recent contentious experience with another engineer or perhaps a business person, and now try to reflect back on how that person may have been feeling. Was he or she perhaps feeling a lot of pressure from someone else in the company? Or perhaps he or she was having some stress with a spouse. Or maybe he or she had to stay up all night because of a child who couldn't sleep. None of these, of course, may actually be true, but studies show that simply imagining these possibilities triggers our brain to feel less antagonistic and more compassionate toward the other person. I'd like to explore 3 groups of behaviors that could bring a more compassionate culture to our teams: compassionate communication, normalization of struggle, and cultivation of learning cultures. Have you ever said something to someone that you've regretted? Of course you have. We all have. And maybe it's something not as severe as this. But for me, these moments usually come when I'm feeling particularly angry or stressed or embarrassed. And it's often because I don't really know how to communicate what I'm feeling or needing. Instead, it's much easier to say that something is simply annoying or stupid or unfair. Just a few years ago, I was introduced by an agile coach at my company to a communication process designed exactly to handle these situations. Nonviolent communication is a communication process developed by Marshall Rosenberg in the 1960s as a tool for positive social change. And it is based on a fundamental principle that underlying all human actions are needs that people are seeking to meet. Nonviolent communication means that we focus on these needs without conveying criticism or moralistic judgments. That is, we honestly express ourselves to others without using blame or criticism. Rosenberg defines 4 components of honest expression: observation, feelings, needs, and requests. So let's take the example of an engineer, Chris, who says to his product owner, Lauren, during an agile retrospective, "It's so annoying that we can never get anything done." This expression can be transformed as follows. First, we extract an observation. Observations in this case would be something that we see or hear, which could cause us to feel a certain feeling. Observations are simply facts, and they do not contain evaluations. When we combine observation with evaluation, people are apt to hear criticism. We can see that in the first observation, that the word annoying is an evaluation and never is an exaggeration inherent with criticism. In the second observation, however, there are 2 facts that are being stated without evaluation. So feelings represent the emotional response that we have to the event observed. The feeling Chris is maybe experiencing is frustration, or maybe he's feeling disappointment. The next step would be identifying Chris's need. Needs are, of course, the necessities we all have in life. So while we share some like food, water, sleep, and security, there are certain emotional needs that vary from person to person. Think, for example, the different social needs between introverts and extroverts. Let's assume that Chris needs to have uninterrupted work to be at his best. If we have this observation, feeling, and a need, the next step would be to identify a possible strategy for meeting this need. Chris might think that a mutually beneficial strategy for him and his product owner would be to always keep mornings meeting-free during the week. So if we rephrase Chris's original message through nonviolent communication, he might instead tell Lauren during their retro, "We had 5 unplanned long meetings this sprint. Therefore, we lost time to complete the stories in the sprint. This made me feel frustrated because I need uninterrupted time to do my best work. Would it be possible for us to agree to meeting-free mornings?" It's easy to see that this kind of honest expression would most likely be more readily received by another person than the first expression of exacerbation. This kind of communication also works well, not only for expressing ourselves with negative feelings, but also when we are feeling positive ones, especially when we are feeling appreciation. Take the example of 2 engineers, Scott and Kate. Kate just helped Scott fix a really difficult bug. Scott might say, "Wow, Kate, you are so smart." And indeed, Scott may be thinking that Kate is really smart, but flattery often feels a bit empty for the receiver. It's relatively cheap to give out and doesn't really give that same hit of altruistic joy. As Rosenberg says, conventional compliments often take the form of judgments, however positive, and sometimes intended to manipulate the behaviors of others. Nonviolent communication encourages the expression of appreciation solely for celebration. A more compassionate expression of appreciation would be simply for Scott to say, "Thank you for pair programming with me to help fix the bug, Kate. I feel relieved now that it's fixed." The next behavior I'd like to explore is normalization of struggle, which essentially means that we have to be more honest with each other about just how commonplace struggle is, and sometimes, ultimately, how commonplace failures are. There was a study in 2016 of the effect of normalization of struggle on students in high schools in low-income areas of New York City. The students were divided into 3 groups. The first group read textbook descriptions of Curie, Einstein, and Faraday, which talked exclusively about the fantastic accomplishments that these scientists had achieved during their lifetime. The second group read about scientists' personal struggles with sexism, classism, and persecution, such as Einstein's flight from Nazi Germany to avoid persecution as a Jew. And finally, the third group read about the scientists' intellectual struggles, such as Curie's persistence despite a string of failed experiments. The results were astonishing. After 6 weeks, the two groups who had read about the scientists who struggled significantly improved their science grades and indicate higher levels of motivation to study science. And the rather troubling result of the study was that the control group of students who read only about the scientists' accomplishments actually performed worse in science and indicated decreased levels of motivation compared to the beginning of the study. This study shows us that it's not only an act of compassion to be honest with each other about our own struggles and failures, but it can also have a significant effect on other people's motivation and achievements. The last group of behaviors that I'd like to look at are ones that inhibit cultures of learning and have the potential to cause toxic work environments. To explain these behaviors in a more relatable way, I'll present a series of so-called anti-patterns, which will inhibit learning cultures, and then suggest compassionate alternatives. So the examples will be imagined conversations between my real colleagues at work, Mary and Claudia, in which we assume that Mary is a very experienced PyCon developer and Claudia is relatively new to the field. So to bring back normalization of struggle quickly, the first anti-pattern is exaggerating the easiness of a problem. So let's say Mary's teaching Claudia how to rebase Git branches. Mary might say, Claudia, rebasing is so easy. But this kind of statement might make Claudia think, I'll look like an idiot if I don't understand rebasing. So a more compassionate alternative is for Mary to say, rebasing was a bit confusing for me at first. I'd be happy to help you get started using it. The next anti-pattern is assumption of the worst. So if we take the previous example of Mary telling Claudia that rebasing is so easy, Claudia's initial reaction may have been to interpret Mary's statement as, you're stupid if you don't understand this. And while that may be a natural reaction, it's also cynically assuming that Mary's statement is ill-intentioned. Perhaps a more compassionate assumption for Claudia is to consider that maybe Mary just wanted to convey that rebasing is something that she shouldn't be intimidated by, and that it's actually doable. The next anti-pattern is feigning surprise. So when Mary finds out that Claudia hasn't heard of PyCon decorators, she might say, what? I can't believe you don't know what decorators are. This kind of expression brings absolutely no social or educational benefit. When people feign surprise, it only has the effect of making themselves feel better and making others feel worse. A more compassionate alternative is for Mary to say, decorators are a really cool feature in PyCon. If you'd like, I could show you an example of where we're using them in production. The next anti-pattern is pessimistic statements of certainty. Let's say Mary and Claudia are planning a new project, and Claudia suggests that they use some unpopular framework, which we can call BizBuzz. Mary responds by saying, a BizBuzz approach definitely won't work. This has the effect of making Claudia feel that she said something wrong. It might even make her reluctant to speak up in the future and ask questions and make more suggestions. A compassionate alternative might be for Mary to say, I once worked on a project where we used BizBuzz, and these are the struggles that we had and the challenges that we faced. And as long as an ideal will not lead to a fatal failure, often it's even better to encourage Claudia to try and experiment on her own to see that she can learn from the struggles and perhaps failures that she encounters. This approach will provide much more educational benefit than Mary simply telling Claudia that she will fail. And the final anti-pattern is reluctance to be vulnerable. Let's say Mary and Claudia are pair programming, and Claudia asks Mary, why do we need a context manager here? But Mary doesn't actually know the answer. Mary might evade the question or confidently make up an answer that might not be correct. This sort of behavior often arises when people are afraid to admit what they might not know. Instead, Mary could admit vulnerability and model curiosity by saying, I could be wrong, but I think it's used here to create a database for interaction. Let's look up the documentation together to be sure. So now we've identified several behaviors to be aware of in order to bring out our most compassionate selves. But at the end of the day, if we aren't first compassionate to our own selves, it's going to be difficult for us to be compassionate to other people. There's a classical study in social psychology called the Good Samaritan experiment, which sheds light on the reasons why we sometimes do and we sometimes do not act in compassionate ways to help others when the opportunities arise for us to do so. The researchers in this experiment had a group of students from the Princeton Theological Seminary prepare sermons on a given topic. The first half of the students were given random Bible topics, and the other half of the students were given the topic of the Good Samaritan, the parable from the Bible in which a man is robbed and left for dead on the side of the road. And later, a priest passes right by without helping the man, whereas the Samaritan stops to help the stranger in need. The students were then told they would need to walk across campus to another building in order to present their sermons to other divinity school students. However, one half of each of the groups were told just beforehand that they really needed to hurry. Strategically placed on the path between the buildings was a man who, like the stranger in the parable, appeared to have been robbed and was moaning, slumped over on the side of the path. So now comes the question, who stopped to help? Were the students who recently just learned of the compassion of the Good Samaritan more likely to aid the man on the path? The answer was no, not at all. As it turned out, the one factor that determined whether a student was stopped to help was whether or not they were in a hurry to get across campus or not. What this study shows us is that when we are put in a position where we are feeling hurried or stressed or exhausted, the beliefs that we have about how people should treat one another are not necessarily translated into our actions. And we are less likely to be our most compassionate selves, and more likely to fall further back on the engagement spectrum towards self-absorption. Of course, in life, it's often not possible for us to control when we will be hurried, or stressed, or exhausted. But there are often ways to mitigate these feelings. For me personally, for example, I know I'll do my best work if I get 8 hours of sleep the night before a working day. So for me, it's an act of self-care when I decide not to stay up that extra hour to watch another episode or two of House of Cards. Self-care, however, is not only about our physical well-being. It's also about how we treat ourselves on an emotional level. When we consider the ways that we can be more compassionate towards ourselves, they are strikingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly similar to the behaviors we adopt to be more compassionate towards other people. Try to think about the last time you made a mistake. Maybe it was forgetting to add some important critical information to a configuration, or accidentally pushing to production, or missing that key unit test. What was the conversation going on in your head when you made this realization? Perhaps you said something to yourself like, "I'm such an idiot. I can't believe I messed that up." To be more self-compassionate means that in difficult moments, you treat yourself as you would treat a best friend, with kindness, patience, and understanding. If you're having a difficult time with a teammate or a stakeholder, consider taking a 5 or 10-minute walk around your neighborhood. In fact, a recent study of medical students suggests that the students who behaved in more compassionate ways toward themselves exhibited fewer signs of burnout and higher levels of motivation and job satisfaction. So I wanted to close by emphasizing that it's easy for all of us to behave more compassionately, but then I realized that this was probably counterintuitive to normalization of struggle. So I just wanted to leave you with the idea that being compassionate is not easy, and often it's not our natural default behavior. But if we can commit to being more mindful, however, it can become a choice. And just as we lift weights to strengthen our muscles, we can slowly adopt more behaviors to strengthen our resolve to make more compassionate choices in order to become our most compassionate selves. So thank you for your attention.